thing that Meno does is present Meno's paradox. Though, of course, it's really Plato who discovered this paradox. He's just writing it so that Meno presents it, or at least that he presents part of it. Meno responds to Socrates' demand that they keep searching for a definition for virtue by saying he doesn't think he can find a definition for virtue. He doesn't think it is possible, given that he now believes he doesn't know what virtue is, for him to figure out what the definition is. There is no point for searching for it under those circumstances of ignorance. He says, "How will you look for it, Socrates, when you do not know at all what it is? How will you aim to search for something you do not know at all? If you should meet it, how will you know that this is the thing that you did not know?" Plato has Socrates immediately say there is something wrong with this argument. Socrates calls it an eristic argument, or a debater's argument. The idea is that it is an argument that a person could present, but that has a conclusion that no person could actually accept or believe. This is actually remarkably close to the literal meaning of the word paradox, which is a statement that is beyond belief, or unbelievable. But then Plato has Socrates restate Meno's argument, and he restates it in a way that changes the argument. Socrates restates the argument as, "A man cannot search either for what he knows or for what he does not know. He cannot search for what he knows, since he knows it, there is no need to search, nor for what he does not know, for he does not know what to look for." The restatement that Socrates gives contains information that is not present in Meno's original challenge. It is only the last line of the quote from Socrates here that expresses Meno's argument, which is that if you don't know what something is, then you can't define it, because you don't know enough about it to complete that task. Socrates has added that if someone does know something, then they can't search for knowledge either. I will present a fully clarified version of the argument on the next slide. So here is the traditional presentation of the argument that Socrates attributes to Meno, though of course Socrates is providing a good portion of this argument himself. 1. You either know X or you do not know X. X here can stand for anything. So this could apply to giraffes, in which case you would be saying, you either know giraffes or you do not know giraffes. 2. If you know X, you cannot inquire/learn about it. Now, of course, Socrates is not talking about inquiry or learning. He is talking about searching. But most people have taken Meno's paradox to be a paradox about inquiry or learning. Intellectual searching, you might say. Not really about searching in general. 3. If you do not know X, you cannot inquire/learn about X. 4. So you cannot inquire/learn about X. 5. So inquiry or learning is impossible. I want to point out a couple of things here. I have put this argument into what is sometimes called standard form. I have taken every statement of the argument, I have separated them, and given them a number to make it easy to evaluate the argument and the parts of the argument and to refer to them. So you can go one by one and ask, well, what do we think of number 1? Is number 1 true? And then we can move on to evaluate number 2. And we can do this separately from the others, and so on and so forth. We can evaluate also the structure of the argument. So, in this case, numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4 are supposed to prove 5, because 5 is the conclusion of the argument. It's where the argument ends. But it is also true that 1, 2, and 3 are supposed to prove 4, and that 4 is supposed to show that 5 is true. That is why I have the word so in front of statements 4 and 5. So is an indicator that something follows from something that came before it. So the way the argument, this is the way the argument basically goes. You either know X or you don't. If you know X, you can't inquire. If you don't know X, you can't inquire. So you can't inquire about X. But X could be anything, so you just can't inquire about anything. Now, this is a really troubling conclusion. It says we can't make any discoveries and we can't learn anything. And that's pretty much our whole intellectual life that would, if this conclusion is true, just sort of come to a stop. There is something to say about this argument by way of evaluating it, and that is that the argument is valid. The word valid is used in contemporary cultures in a lot of ways, and a lot of those ways are just confusing. But when it comes to logic, the discipline that evaluates arguments, to say that an argument is valid is just to say that if the argument's premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true. And this argument is valid. If 1, 2, and 3 are true, then 4 has to be true. And if 4 is true, then given that x could be anything, 5 has to be true. What that means is that there are no mistakes in the reasoning in this argument. It might be the case that the premises, and those are the assumed claims, are false. So 1, 2, and 3 might each be false. You might find a way to show that each one of those is false, or one of them at least. They could also all be untrue. But if all 3 of those are true, then 4 is going to follow, and then 5 is going to follow. So if 1, 2, and 3 are true, then 5 is going to be true. So the question is, if you think the conclusion, number 5, is false, which of the 3 premises do you think is also false? Meno has explicitly endorsed 3. That's the claim he made. He says that if you don't know something, then you can't search for it. Socrates is the source for number 2. Number 1 looks like it just has to be true. It is an instance of something called the law of the excluded middle, which says that every statement is true or it is false. And those are the only 2 options. So either the claim that you know x is true or the claim that you know x is false. If it is false, well, that's the same thing as saying you don't know x. So it looks like those are the only 2 options. So really, it looks like we're down to either 2 or 3 has to be false, if 5, the conclusion, is going to turn out to be false. Now, upon looking at this argument, a lot of people think there is an easy solution to this paradox. They think that it is possible to have partial knowledge of x. Partial knowledge of x just means you don't know nothing at all about x, but you don't know everything. So you know enough to get started on an inquiry, but you still have more to learn. I'll use the example of giraffes again. You might not know everything about giraffes, but you know enough to find them and identify them. And that's enough that you can then study them. Suppose you know where giraffes live, so you know something, but you don't know how they digest food, so you don't know everything. Given what you know, you could go find a giraffe, kill it, cut it open to see how its digestive system works. And there you go, curiosity satisfied. And of course, if you don't know everything about a topic, then there's stuff to learn, so you would have just learned something. It looks like Plato is assuming you either know everything about something or you have no knowledge about it at all. And that does seem really odd. So why doesn't Plato just have Socrates say to Meno, hey dummy, you can have partial knowledge? Why doesn't Plato take this option? And the reason is that this move is going to be difficult for Plato to endorse. Why? Why would he have trouble giving this straightforward answer to the problem? Well, it goes back to the priority of definition. Remember that Socrates says that you can't know anything about x unless you know the definition of x. So I can't know anything about virtue. I can't know whether it is teachable, for example, unless I know the definition of virtue. That's what got this whole dialogue started. And remember from the Euthyphro that a Socratic definition doesn't give you partial knowledge of the thing defined. A Socratic definition tells you the fundamental nature of the thing defined. It tells you what makes something the kind of thing it is, all of its essential properties. A definition of giraffe would tell you what makes something a giraffe. And that would probably include things like the nature of its digestive system. So if you are working with a concept of definitions, like the one that Plato has, then once you know the definition, then it seems like you kind of do know everything about giraffes. Now, you won't know accidental things about giraffes, like how many giraffes there are in the world. But you will know everything essential about them already. Everything that all giraffes have in common that makes them giraffes if you know the definition. So Plato's account of the nature of inquiry, that inquiry involves making derivations from definitions, and his account of what definitions are like, that they include all the essential information about the thing defined, looked like, together, they rule out the easy answer to Meno's paradox. They rule out saying that you can have partial knowledge of something. Now, it's not the priority of definitions alone that generates this problem for Socrates. The priority of definition just says that all knowledge starts with knowledge of definitions. To really get Meno's paradox going, you have to add the nature of the Socratic method into the mix. To see this, let's reconceive Meno's paradox. If you don't know the definition of X, how do you go about finding the definition of X? According to the priority of definition, if you don't know the definition of X, you don't know anything about X. And if you don't know anything about X, how can you start looking for X? You don't even know what it is you are looking for, as Meno said. And to see why this is a problem for the Socratic method, think about the way that the Socratic method works. What Socrates does in the Socratic method is to look for contradictory beliefs on the part of the person he is talking to. The idea being is that once you show them the contradiction in what they believe, they will fix the problem by getting rid of one of the conflicting beliefs. But what that means is that the Socratic method looks like it, at best, only gets rid of false beliefs. And of course, it only gets rid of false beliefs if you pick the correct belief in some contradictory pair to get rid of. If you pick the wrong one, you could end up with a more consistent but also less accurate belief system. For example, imagine someone shows you two beliefs you have. For example, that nothing travels faster than the speed of light, and that aliens from another galaxy have visited Earth are inconsistent. Right, so let's say you have those two beliefs, and someone shows you, those can't both be true. And you decide, in response, to get rid of the belief that nothing moves faster than the speed of light. Your belief system had a contradiction removed, but you've abandoned the true belief that nothing moves faster than the speed of light in favor of keeping the false one, that we've had extragalactic visitors to Earth. But even if you are getting rid of a false belief, right, so even if you avoid that problem, then how does doing that help you learn the definition of something? A definition, if you knew it, would be a true belief. How do you get true beliefs out of this method that just finds and eliminates false beliefs? At best. What if, after you get rid of all your false beliefs about something, you find that you just don't have any beliefs left about it at all? That seems to be the situation that Meno thinks he's in when he makes the challenge to Socrates. He tried to give definitions of virtue, but Socrates knocked all of those definitions down until Meno just claimed that he no longer had anything to say, that he had no idea what virtue was, and thus had no way to find out what it was. So if the Socratic method has the function of finding contradictions and getting rid of them, then it seems like it just can't get anyone who doesn't already know the definition of X to have knowledge of the definition, which means it is a method that can't be the model for discovery or inquiry. So what is the problem and how does Plato solve it? Here we get to something that scholars disagree about. Everything I've said so far is basically agreed to by all scholars. I've emphasized some aspects of the story more than others, but basically what I have said is something you would get from any Plato teacher, any competent teacher of Plato anyway, at any school you go to. But when it comes to how Plato responds to Meno's paradox, Plato scholars do sometimes disagree pretty wildly. There are basically two schools of thought. One is that Plato actually accepts the conclusion of Meno's paradox. This is something I actually used to think for a long time, after first reading the dialogue up until only a few years ago. The idea is Plato is going to go on to say that learning is just recollection, which of course sounds like you aren't really learning at all. Right? And sometimes Plato has Socrates say things that sounds like that. So the idea is, for option one, he actually really thinks we don't learn anything ever. And that what we think of as learning isn't really learning, it's just remembering. The other option, the other way of understanding Plato, which is the way that I now think is correct and that I'm going to present to you, says that he thinks the conclusion is false, and that the conclusion is false because it is possible to inquire or learn about something even if you don't have knowledge about it. That is, he denies the conclusion because he denies premise 3, as I stated the argument above. The key is to realize that you can have true opinions about something, but have no knowledge about that thing. That's going to be the key move he makes. We already know from the Apology that Plato thinks people can believe true things without knowing them. That was the situation of the poets, remember. The idea would be that the Socratic method can help us learn by clearing out the false beliefs we have, leaving only the true beliefs. But where do we get these true opinions or true beliefs? And how can we be sure that everyone has them? Plato's answer to these questions is bound to strike modern listeners as a little odd. The answer is reincarnation. It seems as though Plato was aware of how odd it sounded, given the way he introduces the idea as something he heard someone else say. The someone else, in actuality, was probably someone from the cult of Pythagoras. Pythagoras was a philosopher, mathematician, and mystic who traveled across the Mediterranean world over 100 years before Plato was born, before settling down in southern Italy to found a religious cult, like you do. If you feel like his name is familiar, it's probably because of the Pythagorean theorem, which you probably learned in geometry class. That theorem was almost certainly not discovered by Pythagoras, but rather by a member of his truly weird cult. It was a really weird math cult with lots of really weird rules, which you can go look up online. Anyway, Plato had encountered the Pythagoreans in his own travels around the Mediterranean world after Socrates died, and he had been influenced by their ideas, one of which was the idea of reincarnation, which Pythagoras might have gotten from Hindu religion and philosophy during his travels to the far east of Greece. The Pythagoreans might also be a source for Plato's focus on mathematics, which we will talk a little bit about later. Anyway, that was a little bit of a tangent. Plato has Socrates say to Meno that he has heard of people who believe in reincarnation. And Plato thinks that your memories could survive the process of reincarnation. That would mean that you have information in your mind that was there before you were born. Reincarnation means that your soul is older than your body. It existed before your body and will exist after it. In another dialogue, Plato compares the body to a coat that your soul wears. You wear it until it breaks down, and then you get a new coat. And Plato thinks at least something endures, something survives, something that you can remember or recollect, as Plato says, across these many lives that you have. But what are these things you are remembering? Well, there we get to a little bit of a problem. The situation is this. Either Plato thinks learning is impossible, or he thinks learning is only possible because we have true beliefs that we are born with. Remember, those are the two options for how Plato responds to Meno's paradox. Now, suppose you agreed with Plato about reincarnation and thought that we were born with true beliefs that we remembered. You might think we got those true beliefs in our previous lives. But if we could acquire true beliefs in our previous lives, it seems like we should be able to get them in this life too. I mean, if it worked in a previous life, it should work in this one. And if we can get true beliefs in this life, then why do we need to accept this story about reincarnation in the first place? I mean, the only reason to believe in reincarnation is that it would explain how we could be born with true beliefs. But if in the course of living our lives, we can acquire new true beliefs, why do we need to be born with them? And if we don't need to be born with them, then we don't need to believe in reincarnation in order to solve Meno's paradox. So the situation is that if innate true beliefs are supposed to help, those true beliefs can't be memories from our previous lives. They must have some other source. Plato does not address this question in the Meno, but he will address it indirectly in later dialogues, some of which we will read parts of. Plato's theory of recollection is a big deal. It is one of the first recorded cases of someone in Western civilization believing in an immortal, immaterial soul. Now, immortal souls were something that people believed in quite a bit in the ancient world, actually. But usually that immortality was understood as your body literally going to another place. This is why Egyptian pharaohs were buried with all their stuff that they would use in the ancient world, right, after they died. It's why the Greeks put a coin under the tongue of dead bodies, because they thought that person was, and their body was going to descend into Hades and would have to pay Charon, the boatman, to bring them across the river Styx. So they needed a coin to pay him with. Plato, however, is thinking of the soul as a non-material thing that inhabits the body. When you die, that non-material thing leaves your body behind. So this is a pretty big deal, especially as this idea was going to make its way into Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, in part through Greek influence. There's some evidence that early Judaism did not think of the soul as immaterial, or even really as immortal. It is also important because it is the first recorded defense of the theory of innate ideas. Innate just means born with. Since Plato, however, many people have accepted both his conclusion and his basic argument for the conclusion that we have innate ideas. The way to think about his argument is that Plato is saying we cannot make sense of the knowledge we all possess or of how we acquired that knowledge if we think that we start our lives from scratch as blank slates. So given that we do have knowledge, we must not start out as a blank slate. Similar arguments have been made and similar conclusions have been accepted in a variety of fields. In linguistics, the majority of researchers have accepted, really for decades, that human beings are born with some understanding of basic grammatical rules. Now, of course, they can't be very detailed grammatical rules because different languages have different grammatical rules. But this theory, called generative grammar, says that all natural human languages have some core similarities at the level of grammar, or syntax, and that we are all born understanding those very general, very fundamental aspects of grammar. The argument for this has always been that there's no other way to explain how quickly infants and toddlers pick up the ability to speak their first language. Basically, ever since the 1950s, most linguists have been convinced that there's no way babies start out as blank slates linguistically and learn how to speak by the time they're 2. But modern scientific researchers have also endorsed the theory of innate ideas when it comes to knowledge of math and physics. Some social psychologists think that human beings are born with some basic ideas about reciprocity and fairness and a predisposition to favor other people who display fairness and reciprocity. But of course, none of these modern researchers believe in reincarnation or at least reincarnation plays no role in their scientific theories. And something I want to stress is that you can separate the belief in reincarnation from the belief in innate ideas. It is innate ideas that helps to solve Meno's paradox. But Plato, reasonably, felt like he needed an explanation of how we got innate ideas. His explanation is that we are reincarnated. But over the course of history, the very popular belief in innate ideas has usually been explained in different ways. In the Middle Ages and the early modern period in Europe, people tended to explain innate ideas by saying that God created human beings with innate ideas sort of already preloaded. And nowadays, it is most common to explain innate ideas by appeal to evolution. The key thing to remember is that you can believe in innate ideas without believing in reincarnation. That is just how Plato made sense of innate ideas, sort of for himself personally.